And perspective is very, very important. Our guest, Dr. Thomas Ice, he likes to be called Tommy. Tommy Ice, good to have you back again. We're going to talk about biblical perspective today. On our last broadcast, we talked about 2 Thessalonians, and we talked about this famous verse, 2 Thessalonians 2:3, let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling, or some say the falling away first, and the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. We talked about what that means and where it falls. But today, I kind of wanted to go into a broader picture and let you place all of this into perspective, because a lot of people really don't have a view of the church as it's portrayed in the New Testament. And they'll go back, for example, to Matthew 24, and they think they see the church there.
Right.
And I'd like for you to talk about that for a while and kind of give us your insight.
Well, I think Matthew 24 was given a few days before Christ was killed. And he is concluding and clearing up his ministry with Israel, with the Jewish people. And so here he's giving a prophetic overview of what Israel can expect in the future. And it revolves around those three questions, or some people say it's even one question or two questions, whatever, where they were sitting on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And of course, he talked about the temple. He was talking about the temple. So that's what they're talking about here. And so the Christ answer begins in verse 4, I think runs through the second coming in verse 31. And he's explaining, I think, up through verse 14, the first half of the tribulation. So all of these events, I think, are referring to the tribulation. Now, a lot of people, I remember when I was younger, I held similar views that this is referring to the inter-Advent age, which would include today. And so they see where it says, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and mislead many. You'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars, etc. Interesting study that a guy in a doctoral dissertation pointed out was the order in which Christ talks about these events up through verse 7, 4 through 7, is the same exact order of the first 5 seal judgments in the book of Revelation.
Wow.
And so these are parallel. And so this appears that we almost all believe the book of Revelation, in chapter 6 is talking about the first parts of the tribulation.
So this is worth noting. For those of you who haven't really thought about this, Jesus is answering questions, and he's looking into the future, but he's looking past the church.
Yes.
Into the era of the tribulation.
Exactly.
Now that's amazing. I mean, if you haven't thought about that, you say, wow, I've never thought about that.
Well, because if you back up even more, the 70 weeks of Daniel were prophesied for the nation of Israel, that at the end of the 70 weeks of years, 490 years, the kingdom would come.
Yeah.
And that's why we believe that Christ rode into Jerusalem on the very day on a donkey when the first 483 years ended to the very day. And they said, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, etc. But because the nation rejected him, the 70th or the last week is postponed. And when you look in Daniel 9, the 70th week is isolated in a single verse there at the end of that section in Daniel 9, 24 through 27. And so we believe that the 70th week has been postponed because none of the 6 purposes listed in verse 24 have come to pass, not one of them. And so he says at the end of that time, and so he's postponing with the church age, something that Paul and others later revealed in the epistles primarily, that And so he's giving the end times. He's talking about the 70th week of Daniel here in Matthew 24. That's going to lead up to the conversion of the nation of Israel, because the condition, in fact, you see it at the end of chapter 23, the condition for the second coming is stated there. And Jesus said, "Oh, Jerusalem," in verse 37 of Matthew 23, "Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks." The word gathered is used later, by the way, in chapter 24 in an interesting way. "And you were unwilling." He says, "Behold, your house is being left to you desolate." I think it's probably a reference to the temple. "For I say to you, from now on you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" That's described in Zechariah 12:10, where it says he will send them the spirit of grace and supplication, and then they will look upon him whom they have pierced, and they will mourn as one mourns for an only begotten son. In other words, the nation's converted. We learn in Zechariah that a third part of them are going to be converted, and the 2/3 as part of the tribulation are going to be wiped out. They're going to be purged out, so that by the time of the end of the tribulation, the entire nation is converted, and they call on him. And that is the requirement for the second coming, is for them to call on. And so he says that at the end of this judgment section of chapters 22 and 23, "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'"
So as I'm reading Matthew 24 now, I'm going to skip down to verse 8, and it says, "All these are the beginning of sorrows."
Yes.
And what does that mean? The beginning
the
of
first
sorrows.
part of the tribulation. And he asks, "Is this the end?" He says, "No." And then in the middle, "Is this the end?" "No." And then when he gets to the end of this section in verse 24, he says, "But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, etc. And the sign of the Son of Man will appear." In other words, he's coming back. And so this is the first part of the tribulation. No, he's not coming back yet. And so the book of Revelation expands upon this, but he lays it out here, and it's referring, I think, that's one of the major reasons I believe that this does not refer to the present age as many believe.
And it's been taught that way by
Yes.
some, and it's very confusing.
I held that view for many years.
So what we have in Matthew 24 is a forward look across time and space into the years of the tribulation.
That's right.
And as you look at this, there is the second coming in verse 27. Again, we're in Matthew 24. "For as lightning cometh out of the east, shineth even out of the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be." The rapture of the church there?
No.
No. But I can tell you, and you know this, a lot of people have taught that.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I don't know, maybe a majority of pre-tribulationists believe that the rapture's in Matthew 24. When I was a student at Dallas Seminary, not one of our professors back in the 70s believed that the rapture was in Matthew 24. They all believed that it was taught later, as we talked about on a different program.
Yes.
And so this is talking to Israel, and this is something that's going to take place during the tribulation. He's giving an overview of this, a summarization really of what the Old Testament teaches, and then later expanded upon by the Apostle John in the book of Revelation. And you can see tremendous parallels. And the key event, the pivot of the passage is verse 15, where he says, "Therefore," and by the way, let me just comment on verse 14. "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to the whole world for a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come." This has often been used by missions organizations to say we've got to reach everybody before Jesus comes back. That's not what it's saying, referring to. It's saying during the tribulation, the gospel is going to be preached. And so you have normal evangelism going on. You have the two witnesses in dealing with Israel, the 144,000 Jewish witnesses all over the world preaching the gospel. And then you even have angelic angels, it says, that preaches the gospel to every tribe, kindred, tongue, or nation, in other words, to everybody all around the world. So that's what I think this is relating to, is the gospel being preached by the midpoint of the tribulation. Why? Because after that, the mark of the beast is going to be given, you see. And so once if you take the mark, that means it says very clearly in Revelation, your destiny is the lake of fire. So it says, therefore, the abomination of desolation, which is spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those, etc. In other words, they're supposed to do something. And so the abomination of desolation, if this is future, which it is, requires a rebuilt temple. This is one of the four major passages that imply that the temple's got to be rebuilt by the midpoint of the tribulation.
One of the things that has typified the last century and this one is the watching for Israel to rebuild the temple.
Yes.
And there are two groups in Israel today, as you well know, that are really, really moving forward with their plans, training priests, drawing plans, doing all sorts of things. And just as a side note, our president has even announced to the Israeli government that he would like to pave the way for them to build a temple, which is the first time an American president has done such a thing.
That's because he's the last Trump.
You had to say that.
I had to say that, sorry, even though it's out of context.
My point here is that it's so easy to look at Matthew 24 and say, wow, this is all happening, right now. Maybe, but then something else has to happen first.
The rapture of the church.
The rapture of the church.
Exactly.
So, and the reason I'm going this way is because a lot of people have a difficulty with this distinction, the timeline, if you will.
Yeah, Randy Price and I wrote a book in the early 90s called Ready to Rebuild. And we interviewed the top 11 Jewish leaders, some who only spoke Hebrew. Randy speaks Hebrew. On efforts to rebuild the temple in the early 90s. And of course, a lot has gone on since then, but you're right. That temple movement has gotten stronger and stronger among the populace as a whole in Israel. But I would still say that the nation as a whole is opposed to doing that. And so, we speculate what's going to cause them to rebuild the temple, probably after the rapture, most likely.
Now, we're doing a quick look at Matthew 24, and there's no way in a half hour we can cover it all, but what I want to do is talk about what's going on here. There's the tribulation mentioned in Matthew 20, and there's the second coming is mentioned in Matthew 24.
29 through 31.
And as you then move down into the illustration of the days of Noah, starting in verse 36, and everybody says, okay, that's a picture of the rapture right there because one's taken and one's left. Isn't that a picture of the rapture?
No, because they're taken in judgment.
Okay.
It becomes clear as you read the context. For example, in Luke's version, it says, and where are they taken? It says, where the worm dieth not, and I forget that other. In other words, it's a description of judgment. And so the one taken is removed at the second coming. The one left is left to go into the kingdom because the coming is not the rapture, but the second coming of Christ.
Okay.
And we see this in verse 31, and he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect. Now, the term elect is used in verse 22 and 24 to refer to Jewish people, Jewish believers, from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So Jews are scattered in the second half all over the world. Many of them are evangelizing, etc. And so at the second coming, they're brought back angelically instead of flying on El Al airline, and they will be brought back individually by an angel in order to do what? To then go into the millennium and fulfill their purpose and calling at that point.
Wow.
So this is no rapture.
So you have the parable of the fig tree, which is Israel.
Yes.
You have the days of Noah illustrations, one taken and one left. And as you turn the page, you come to chapter 25, the parable of the 10 virgins. And today, I wanted Tommy to take a look at that and put the 10 virgins parable into context here, into the context of what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's in the context of him giving illustrations through these parables of what the kingdom of God's going to be like. For example, as it was in the days of Noah, he's talking about this coming of the Son of Man. It's going to be a time of chaos and judgment, you see. And the faithful householder, et cetera, talking about qualities that a believer should have. And so he comes to the 10 virgins, and this is talking about preparedness, and it's relating to the nation of Israel. I would argue every parable relates directly to the nation of Israel, because parables were started in the flow of Christ's ministry after the official rejection of Christ, as we see in Matthew 12, when they accused him of being demonic.
Right.
And so Jesus says in Matthew 13, I will not speak to this people again. He's saying publicly, except through parables. And so he goes and gives a parabolic prophetic outline for the nation of Israel in those parables in Matthew 13. And then he has others scattered throughout parts of the gospel. And here we see him talking about a parable, parabole. Para means alongside of, bole means to cast. So you're going from the known to the unknown. At least in his day it was known, to illustrate something. And so he said, then the kingdom of heaven will be comparable to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. And so this was part of the Jewish custom, is when a guy was coming, they didn't have, he didn't text her and say, hey babe, I'm on my way, none of that kind of, not even smoke signals or anything like that. But the betrothal took place, which was technically a time of actual legal marriage. And the bridegroom was to go back to the father's house and add on to the thing. And you see that in some of those biblical movies, how they would have a walled hacienda type thing. You see in Mexico, very similar. And in the middle, they would have their cooking and eating in this temperate environment. And then they would have building on another room would usually be a bedroom and then a sitting room. And so the son would go back and build that. And, to make sure that he doesn't just throw up some shack or a tent or something there in his eagerness to take his bride, the father had to approve the construction or the add-on, that it was adequate and proper. And then the father would send the son at any moment to get his bride. And in the meantime, the bride, the betrothed, it was a time of testing, to test to make sure that she was going to be devoted or faithful or pure in this period. And she would gather together things for her marriage, or hope chests, as we call them nowadays. And so he would come, let's say she lived in another town, and the wedding party would come, and they would give a shout. And here you have the picture of bridesmaids looking for this coming pretty soon. And some of them were irresponsible. They didn't put oil in their lamps. And so the shout, or the word that the marriage is about to be consummated, is given, and the wise ones had oil in their lamps. And whether this is a picture of the Holy Spirit or not, whatever, it's fine. But it shows that they were prepared. And it is clearly a reference to believers as a whole. But the unprepared said, we got to go in and buy some oil.
Right.
And by the time they come back, the door has closed to the wedding, it says, and they're not allowed in. And so this would be unfaithful Israel. So I think it's just saying, And once again, it's talking about Israel.
Right.
It's talking about some will be prepared and some will not.
Now, the context, as we've seen, starting back in Matthew 24, is Israel, not the church.
Right.
And that continues in chapter 25, I take it.
Yes, and you have him going on talking about, in a sense, laying out Israel's future through these parables. So they talk about the foolish virgins, and this simply means unmarried women who actually were virgins back then, I guess,
Yeah.
as well, and the prudent ones, the ones who were preparing. See, that's the point of the passage. You're supposed to prepare in the interim while you're waiting for the bridegroom to come. And so you're right. Sometimes we call this making a parable walk on all fours. In other words, they come in, some people take all the details and give meaning to a lot of the specificity of the details. And sometimes it's not wrong necessarily, but each parable, the point of a parable is to have a key lesson that's being taught.
Now, let me ask you a quick question here. I've heard Matthew 25 talked about as Israel's view of the rapture.
Well, there's no rapture.
There's no rapture here.
There's a bride, but there's
a
no
bride,
rapture.
and I'm putting this out because such an individual would say, well, the bride who goes in and the door is closed, that's the church taken out and secreted away. Now, do you follow that, or
Not at all, because the rapture is not disclosed chronologically by Christ until 3 days later in the upper room discourse, the night before he was killed. All of this stuff in Matthew, Mark, and Luke especially relates to Israel.
To Israel. I just wanted to make that clear, because I've heard people say, well, this bride certainly seems like the church.
Well, and that's why when you read, older commentaries where everything's the church,
Right.
you have some weird, not only interpretations, but applications of these things. But if it refers to future aspects relating to Israel, then you don't have the problems interpreting this passage that you would otherwise.
So what we have here, and this is sort of what I wanted to clarify today, is last week we started with 2 Thessalonians. We talked about what that is indicating and what is to happen to the church. And your temptation is to go back into the Gospels and see if you can lock these two ideas together. And a lot of people have done this, have put the rapture back in Matthew 24. And so I sort of wanted to clarify just a little bit where we need to keep our limits and rules of interpretation.
Yeah, in the flow of God revealing his program through Christ and then the apostles, etc., the rapture wasn't introduced until the night before Christ died in the upper room discourse. And what's important about that is everything in the upper room discourse that Jesus is teaching once Judas leaves 2/3 of the way through John 13 is brand new church age truth.
So when he said
to the future church,
I'm going to go away for a while, then I'm going to prepare a place for you. That
I will come and take you, receive you to myself. Take.
And take would be the rapture.
Yes, exactly.
But that's
that where I am, where is he heaven, you will be also.
And I think that really makes the point. The rapture is almost a private bit of business there, as Jesus spoke to his closest confidants and said, here's what's going to happen.
Well, you can take that betrothal explanation that we just explained and apply that to the rapture, because Paul talks about wanting to be the best man. I want to present a spotless virgin, etc., talking about the body of Christ, etc. And so you see that motif being presented in relation to the rapture as well.
And Thomas Ice, Tommy, has written this book, The Case for Zionism. We lapsed into temple building and other things that are going on today. And you've written this book about Zionism. And you know, Zion has been dragged through the mud the last couple centuries, or maybe more than that. And when you're writing this, what are you doing? What's your message here?
I'm defending the modern Zionist movement as a fulfillment of prophecy, the beginning of fulfillment of prophecy. And interestingly enough, you have an explosion of pro-Israel sentiment within a generation after the Reformation began, because they're studying the Bible.
As a matter of fact, the things that are going on in Israel right now are really exciting.
They really are, and we're moving closer and closer to having the stage being set.
What should we think about Israel? That's the title of this one, and with a foreword by Mark Hitchcock, and you contributed to this?
Yes, a bunch of different authors defending a literal view of Israel against a lot of criticism from evangelicals.
We should support Israel,
yes,
right? I
definitely.
mean, because they are such a close, if you will, figure to what the Bible describes. We can actually watch what's happening in Israel and kind of see the outlines of what's in the Bible. Uncovering the Secrets of Bible Prophecy, Jeff Kenley. Can We Still Believe in the Rapture? Ed Heinzen, Mark Hitchcock. And this is the last part of our offer today, Charting the Bible Chronologically, Ed Heinzen, Thomas Ice. What's unique about this book?
Well, we chart the entire beginning to the end of history and biblical history, and we cover each section and have charts showing the key players and things like this that chronologically traces you all the way through the Bible.
Gives you clarity, and we all need that. For your gift of $60, these books, which we're calling the Thomas Ice Collection, can be yours, and we'll ship them to you anywhere in the United States, absolutely free of charge. Check our library, prophecywatchers.tv. Go to the online library, scroll down, you'll find the Thomas Ice Collection. And Tommy, time has run out.
Well, I can't wait for time to run out in history.
Amen. I'm Gary Stearman. Hey, we're watching. You'll be watching too. Thanks for joining us on Prophecy Watchers. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com, where you can sign up for our free email newsletter, or follow us at facebook.com/prophecywatchers. In the meantime, keep watching, everybody, and we'll see you soon.